Zaki Laïdi, would you like to begin?
Yeah, thank you. Well, I will start talking about the main issue, which is Ukraine. We were here 1 year ago with virtually the same panelists, including the anchorman. And I would like to just insist on what has changed and what has not changed since last year. So what has not changed is, from a European perspective, a strong alignment with Ukraine. We are the main provider of economic and military aid to Ukraine, and I insist on that point. We are the main provider of economic and military aid to Ukraine, ahead of the United States. So our contribution is huge, and it will certainly remain important. Second, there is no doubt that Russia will remain, for the EU, a major security threat for the next years. And all the assessment made by the military in Europe conclude that Russia will reinforce its military capacity, and therefore the Europeans have, of course, to avoid any kind of military confrontation with Russia. It would be irresponsible, but we need to deter Russia. And in order to deter Russia, we need to ramp up our military effort on a national basis, but we have to do it also collectively. We are now talking about reaching not simply the 2% target, but the 3% target. But this is not going to be enough if we do not start working seriously together. So there are a lot of discussions, a lot of projects on the table, very huge projects on the table, in order to ramp up the military effort of the European Union. At the same time, we all know the obstacles on the way, including bilateral cooperative programs, such as the French and the German programs, which are not in a very good shape. So this is what has not changed. What has changed is, first, the fact that we, of course, have to realize that Russia didn't collapse, that the regime in Russia has adapted itself to a war economy, in spite of the huge problem the Russian economy is facing. So we cannot underestimate those difficulties. They're huge, but at the same time, the Russians have been able to adapt, and the regime is not on the verge of a collapse. It has adapted itself to a war economy. I mean, there are very, very different ways. On the military front, we are facing what I call a sort of bloody stalemate. A bloody stalemate in the sense that the Russians are advancing in the Donetsk very slowly, but they are advancing, and they are advancing at a huge human cost. In October, Russia lost 1,500 soldiers during the month of October. It's the highest casualty since the beginning of the war, which means that the progression has a huge cost. But the Russians have a huge capacity to generate new forces. And if they lose between 1,000 or 1,500 soldiers a day, they are able to generate at least 25,000, 30,000 soldiers a month. Moreover, the Russian regime had been able to overcome the political obstacle created by a possible draft. And if you look at the composition of Russian forces in Ukraine, you see that 70% of the soldiers are engaged on the basis of contracts. They are contractors, people who have a contract. You have convicts, 12%, and you have only 7% of people who have been drafted, which means that the political pressure from the population on the regime is lower. Moreover, those who get money to go to war, their life expectancy is limited, around 3 weeks or so, but the families get the money. And there is a very interesting chart which shows the evolution of saving rates in Russia, but also in Tuva and in Buryatia. And you see that the saving rates are skyrocketing in Buryatia and Tuva, whereas on average, the saving rates in the rest of Russia is, increasing, but not that much. Which means that politically, the Russian regime had been able to adapt itself. On the military front, and I can develop this point, but very quickly, the Russians have been able, and this is something which is not mentioned a lot in the publication and in debate in the press. The Russians have acquired a formidable capacity to master the EW, electronic warfare.
Sorry, we need to wrap
Yeah.
up a little, so we can get everyone.
Now, for us as Europeans, we all know, and everybody knows, to be frank, that there would be no military solution to the conflict in Ukraine. I think that everybody agrees with this. Now, we need to support the Ukrainians in order to face the Russians in a possible political negotiations. When I was with the High Representative in Kyiv 3 weeks ago, we discussed the different scenario. I would not enter into details, but of course, we need to support the Ukrainians to face the possibility of a political negotiations.
Thank you very much. You were just in Ukraine, as you mentioned, just a couple of weeks ago. You sat down with Volodymyr Zelensky, the president of Ukraine. I presume Joseph Borrell was also there with you at that meeting. Maybe just give us one anecdote from that meeting, very quickly, what you learned.
Well, I will not disclose the content, but what I can say is that he was very appreciative of the role of the European Union, and of course they are interested in. But this is on the public record. Joining very quickly NATO. I don't think it's going to happen. Their participation to the European Union is progressing quite well, but it doesn't mean that it's going to take place within 5 years. So very appreciative on the role of the EU in general and in detail.
said like a true veteran diplomat. Very good.